We are in these wind-swept, semi-deserty regions of Jordan with the hope to find out more about the mysterious desert kites and circles, about the 150 kilometers long cut shebib wall, which is also referred to as being mysterious, and the so-called big circles of Jordan, which reach of up to half a kilometer in diameter. Since they are not that impressive from ground level, they came into the spotlight in modern times only after people started seeing them from airplanes. What intrigued me during this visit was, first of all, what happened to all this quite big population actually, which could have made all these many thousands of circles and kites. What happened to them and when did all that happen? Also, I was impressed by the precision with which the big circles were drawn onto the land. It's a hilly area, so it's not that easy actually to make a perfect circle. Also, I was somewhat puzzled by the origin of this layer of black stone of which all these structures are made. This is how the fields with those pretty kites and circles look from ground level. In the very beginning we were wondering how are we gonna distinguish them from the modern earthworks, but it turned out to be quite simple. Stones which were not moved for a long time, they had lichen on the top only, and also they had distinct black suntan, so to say. Both of these conditions certainly show towards the fact that they have been in that position for at least a couple of 100 years, possibly even much more, but they are definitely historic.
Only on the one side, underneath is...
This is an example of a field in pristine condition. All the stones have their lichen on the top. Nobody has tampered with them in modern times. And this is an example of a relatively small cluster of circles, also quite well preserved. Even the small pile or tower, so to say, has not been destroyed by treasure hunters, because sometimes such towers have burials. So why were they built? The answer is pretty much for any type of human activity you can imagine. For example, the ones that really look like kites, something circular and roundish with a long path leading to it, those seem to have been used for trapping animals. For example, hunting gazelles while they migrate. Contemporary historic accounts also tell that some of the circles were used for herding animals, shamanic activities, and basically this landscape is so desolated that anything, absolutely anything you want to do, you will have to start with moving some stones around. Otherwise, it's even difficult to walk in such terrain. Basically, you have to plan every single step as you walk, unless you want to have your ankle twisted.
What it's like. It's really difficult to walk through these rocks, much less any kind of vehicle in here. Plus you can see my foot, they're kind of big.
So I personally see no mystery in terms of how or why all these stone structures were made. It is their sheer number which makes me wonder. The red dots on this map signify regions with lots of circles and kites. It is very incomplete because the entire concept of mapping things is not very popular in Jordan, and because these beautiful earthworks, historic earthworks, have been left alone only at the most bleak and harsh regions. The rest has been simply wiped away with bulldozers for agriculture or estate development. And the amount of circles is just endless, pretty much like the South African circles, which are very similar, by the way. So, looking at the historic population numbers of Jordan, we notice that the numbers soared within a century, let's say, from barely 500,000 to 10 millions today. And still, they're not actively utilizing those most desolated, unwelcoming regions where still kites and circles are to be found undisturbed. So I wonder how many people would have lived over there to make these circles. And the surroundings back then were not any less bleak than they are now, so it wasn't fun making them in the heat. With those heavy stones, it's not like making castles on the beach when you're bored. Not to mention that under normal circumstances, people would agree to live in such desolate regions only when the more fertile lands are already occupied by other nations or other tribes, which makes this question even more valid. How many people did live in Jordan at that time when they were making these circles and kites? And if it was that many of them, then how come only 500,000 survived when the population was counted a century ago? Before trying to make guesses about the answer to this question, I would like to address the topic of the origin of the layer of black stones, a very uniform layer which covers large parts of Jordan. Basically, we crossed all of Jordan, north to south and east to west. We went everywhere, and always the same situation. Endless fields, barren and covered with very uniform layer of these rounded dark stones. And although there were patches here and there with less stones, patches of the land which are not so dark with black stones, we did not see anywhere stones being piled up naturally. Like here, this is part of a circle, that's why they're on the top of one another. But otherwise, in the pristine landscape, it is the uniformity of this layer which made me question the origin of the stones. So, mainstream geology gives us only two options to choose from. One is stones carried and rounded by rivers, or option two, stones which broke off from the bedrock and eroded. As far as the option of being carried and rounded by rivers, that is out of question because, again, this layer is uniform. The stones are same on the top of the hills and down in the valleys. It's not some sort of wide river bed. It is just everywhere. This thin layer covers the entire region, even beyond Jordan. And the most important is that piles of these stones never occur naturally. You see some piles here, but this is modern work. We can say that because some of the light colored sides of the stones face upwards. If they were old, they would be covered with lichen. But piles, they do not occur naturally. So here they did some digging for the modern road, and we can see what lies below this layer of stones. So we see a bedrock of the same stone probably as the layer on the top mixed with clay. And that's why we would expect that the top thin layer of rounded stones must have broken off from this bedrock and must have gotten rounded by the elements. So if this top layer is eroded bedrock, then why is it so uniformly spread? Really like a rule, only one stone at a time. When boulders erode, they don't arrange their pieces like that. It is way more chaotic. There would be parts of the boulders sticking from the ground. There would be sharp pieces which are not yet completely rounded. But we don't see that in reality. We see uniform stones already rounded, which stay pretty much unchanged to our eye for a very, very long time because even with the oldest circles and kites, we see the sides of the stones on the top covered by lichen, which is normal. These are very hard rocks and very heavy. This is not some sort of pumice. It is normal that they don't erode fast. And on the other hand, this landscape didn't have all these millions of years that the mainstream geologists always want you to believe in to evolve into what it is now. This was lush tropical greenery only a couple of thousand years ago. Confirmed by the Quran, by the Bible, and even by the most recent mainstream research. Everybody has heard about the biblical story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, Sodom and Gomorrah are exactly in this region of deserts in the Middle East. And this destruction, which according to the Bible happened during the time of Abraham, turned the tropical paradise into the desert that we see now in an instant. Although the Bible texts can be quite blurry in terms of when actually things happened, still the general indications give hint towards like somewhat less than 2000 years before Jesus, which would make it 3 or 4000 years ago. 3000 if we take the new chronology dating of when did Jesus appear, to which I tend to side. Or if we believe the mainstream, the popular idea that Jesus came 2000 years ago, then the tropical paradise would have been destroyed some 4000 years ago. And as far as mainstream estimates, they talk about various dates and periods ranging from 6000 years ago to 1000 years ago. So getting back to the original question, where did the thin layer of round black stones come from? As we were driving for hours and hours in the Jordanian countryside, and I was looking at them, I always had the feeling as if it was one time event which burned the top layer of the earth and turned it into these stones. And then I started thinking about all that tropical paradise which was destroyed. And then I thought, wait a minute, this is exactly a one time event. Maybe it wasn't very local to Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe that's how all these deserts in the Arabian Peninsula were formed. And that would explain very well why this layer is so uniform, same on the top of the hills and same in the bottom of the valleys. And who knows, maybe initially there were so many people to make all these stone circles and kites. They might have simply survived from the times when the land was beautiful and habitable. By the way, all the circles which I'm showing on my footage are relatively small because it is in reality very hard to reach authentic old circles. They are far away from any road, kilometers inside the desert, through which is difficult to even walk. Also, we had problems with the piercing winds. The connection I made to Sodom and Gomorrah was maybe a little bit too speculative. That doesn't even qualify for a hypothesis because it has no supporting evidence. Probably more likely would be that this top layer, the uniform top layer, is laid barren because the winds, which are very fierce in that area, they simply swept out the mud which was in between only the top layer of stones. And the rest remained sheltered, frozen in time, since maybe the great biblical scale flood which made this mixture of rocks and clay. Now, although the Bible talks about the great flood as it being singular, I think everybody by now is becoming aware that it was a number of great floods of biblical proportions. Just a few days ago, Oshara from the Set House in New York sent me an extremely interesting material which remained buried under tons of unpublished sessions, and almost nobody knew about it. Over there, Set speaks about sound technology devices which were used to cut those intricate carvings at Baalbek, for example. Also, he talks in length about the origins of the Sumerian culture and the entities who taught them how to live and how to be civilized. So very soon I'll be making a video explaining again why the set channeled information is the only reliable channeled information about our ancient history, at least for me so far. And also I will be publishing the information from this extremely interesting session about the pyramids and the Sumerians and everything else. And here is a very short quote from this session relevant to the biblical floods. Quote, "In some respects, the over-enthusiastic use of the sound was responsible for the flood mentioned in the Bible and other literature. It was for this reason that many attempts were made to warn against the impending disaster. The use of sound was important at various times in irrigating dry areas, quite literally by pulling water from a distance. There were several characteristics that proved difficult, however. Literally, the sound traveled further often than it was intended, causing consequences not planned upon. Great precision was required in using it. Sound was also used after irrigation to speed up the flowering of plants and to facilitate transplantation to other areas. It was also utilized for medicinal purposes in operations, particularly in bone and brain operations. Many civilizations grew and flourished in fertile areas simply because the people knew how to make them fertile and keep them that way. End of quote. Although the bird's eye view of the kites and the circles is kind of interesting, they lack the precision of the Nazca lines. This is an example of a kite which they begin to destroy with modern infrastructure. But there is no mystery in terms of how the kites or the circles would have been made. But the case with the so-called big circles is somewhat different. Their radius varies from half a kilometer to quarter of a kilometer. This is an incomplete map of some of the circles which have survived. They are being actively destroyed by agriculture, and those of Saudi Arabia are not included in this map. Maybe if they really start issuing tourist visas to Saudi Arabia, this may reveal more information about the circles. Tourist visas for Saudi Arabia don't exist. They don't want tourists. A couple of times in the past they announced we are gonna start issuing them, and then they announced that we changed our mind. So recently, just weeks ago, they announced that they have finally decided that absolutely for sure we are gonna allow tourists to visit and obtain tourist visa on arrival. So let's see if this time they will implement it before they change their mind again. We managed to visit a couple of the circles, and this is how they look after they get plowed over a few times. Somebody has been cultivating some sort of crop here below the black plastic. But judging from the remains, there was nothing much high-tech about the structure of the circles as such. But again, the interesting about them is that although they went up and down the hillsides, still their overall shape is quite regular. Probably this level of precision would have required for those people a considerable amount of endeavor. It wouldn't have been so difficult if they were built on flat lands, but they were all on hilly areas. This is a well-preserved but small circle at a site called Humeima, which unfortunately we could not explore properly because it was some 20-30 kilometers long, and there was no map of where the things are actually. And then this is the 150 kilometers long Cat Shebib wall. It is declared as mystery because nobody knows who, when, and why built it. That is the mainstream attitude towards this wall. What a clever trick. When they can't put something in their fantasy historic timeline, they use the unnecessary mystification card so that the rest of what they tell us will look actually proven and real. The naked truth is that we know next to nothing about the history of the entire region. Here we found a place where one can cross the so-called wall even with the car. I personally don't even see how this could have served as a wall. I mean, it's just too small. I mean, too low to have any defense purpose. But who knows? maybe against thieves of sheep or something like that. And as we drove through these arid landscapes, looking at the cleared fields where the top layer of black stone has been removed for agriculture, I was wondering, we noticed the kites and the big circles just because of their somewhat artistic or regular shape. But only God knows how much of the cleared land has been cleared in modern times and how much was already cleared and the modern people are simply reusing it. Who knows, maybe the situation in the Middle East is very similar to that of Italy and Turkey, where so much is built on the existing infrastructure without the conscious awareness of the modern people that this is the case. Just because it has some modern makeup on the top and because they're trained not to notice the older rock ruins in the case of Turkey and Italy, they just automatically assume that it must be modern, the full thing, while only 5% on the top, the cosmetic stuff, is modern. This could very well be the case in Jordan, because again, as I said, if that many people lived in the semi-desert where it is difficult even to walk, then how many people must have inhabited the more fertile areas where the fields are cleared?